For Wisconsin, Illinois, and Ohio, they have policy pending in a year or two. The dark gray states indicate where at least one campus, and sometimes up to a dozen or more, participated in field testing. So we've had some major milestones along the way. Things actually got initiated in 2009, and there were various tryouts of tasks. A number of states and campuses got involved. At that time, we had about 6 handbooks for EdTPA, 6 versions in different subject areas. We moved along to some more serious piloting. In the 2010-11 academic year, we did some train-the-trainers scoring with nearly 1,100 portfolios were scored by campuses. And then we moved on into developing additional handbooks in more subject areas. And then we started our more official field testing in the spring of 2012. We've proceeded from there. We're continuing to field test this spring, and we now have handbooks developed in collaboration with subject matter organization, faculty, and teacher educators from around the country. Now we have EdTPA in 27 versions, plus about another 20 that are specific to the program standards and teacher expectations in the state of Washington. So we're continuing with the field test, and we will launch EdTPA this fall along with a final technical report with all of the reliability and validity studies, and we are conducting national standard setting. National standard setting based on data from the field test and input from a variety of stakeholders. That will be happening this June. Ongoing, and this will speak to my item number 10 on implementation and inquiry. We are constantly in communication with our state partners, our IHE partners. We have implementation conferences. We use our TPAC online platform for Q&A, for distributing resources and materials, and to continue to engage the teacher ed and the teacher preparation community in thinking about how this assessment can be educative. Okay. Item 3. The relationship between Stanford and Pearson. And here's where we're going to get to some of the mythology that I mentioned early on. We have very clear definitions of who does what for EdTPA. Stanford owns the intellectual property of EdTPA and all of the design and development work of the assessment itself, as well as the scoring training design, the benchmarking, and the materials developed for scoring training come from Stanford. Stanford's Board of Trustees has the copyright. Now Pearson, and I want to pause here for a minute. Having an assessment that is used in teacher preparation at a national scale requires an operational vendor. And there isn't in the history of testing, licensure testing of any sort, where even testing done at the state level was done without a vendor. And so Stanford, when we saw that there was interest in PAC-TE and there was interest in developing an assessment for to be nationally available, Stanford, Linda Darlingham and Ray started talking to the various testing companies and said, we think we need your help, but we're not going to let you own it. And Pearson said, we're in. We'll participate. We will support you to take this assessment to a national scale. And this assessment would not be where it is if we didn't have Pearson as a partner for their roles, which, as an operational partner, they are supporting Stanford and AACTE with all of our assessment development processes and with the technical review that's necessary to have a reliable and valid assessment. They're allowing the scaling up of this assessment at a national scale and will support sustainability for scoring and so on. They provide the infrastructure, and they've invested enormous resources in the design and development of technological platforms for candidates to submit their materials, for faculty to provide feedback on those materials, for scorers to be in a scoring system where scoring can be done not only efficiently, but reliably and with a high level of validity. and for results to get reported back to campuses. They're also working with us on a usage plan where campuses can stage in to adopting EdTPA in the window leading up to policy, or to try it out to see if there's interest. So before I go any further, I want to acknowledge Nathan Estel, who, from Pearson, who's here today in the audience. There's Nathan. Give him a wave. Any Pearson-related questions? He's the guy. We are both here through the day today, and we'll answer any questions, any further questions about anything I bring up in the keynote, anything that happens on the panel, and so on. So this usage plan, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's available on our public website, but it is an opportunity for campuses to get started on using EdTPA with very limited commitment and have exposure to the assessment and to try it out. Because it is an assessment that you don't want to come at cold turkey or have as a gotcha at the end of a program. It's something that does require careful thought and action. So I'm going to say a little bit more about local evaluation, which is in the exploratory stage. There is no fee for EdTPA until it is consequential for a campus or a state. And at that time, the cost we're estimating to be $300 for each portfolio to be scored. Anyone in the room a National Board Certified teacher? Raise your hand proudly. Uno? One. Congratulations. National Board certification is a very high bar, and whenever I meet a National Board teacher, I have to congratulate them. But National Board is a lot more expensive than this, which is one of the reasons why I pointed out. Currently, it's about $2,200 for a National Board candidate to go through their support process and to have their materials scored. And so $300 for a performance-based assessment is quite remarkable, especially given that it is subject-specific. And this is point number 4. And this is one I will talk about and talk about and talk about because it's the way, when I'm not out doing talks like this, we are back at the shop working so hard to make sure that we do everything 27 times. Because this assessment is not generic. It is tailored to the high leverage teaching behaviors and the high leverage pedagogy in 27 fields. So it's a lot of heavy lifting to have an assessment that is done in 27 fields. Now, that's not to say the 27 versions are completely independent of one another. They are not. They share a common architecture, and they share these very important design principles. First, it is discipline and subject specific, and the EdTPA process, when a candidate assembles their portfolio, they are doing so embedded in the curriculum of their teacher education program and embedded in the teaching and learning of the students they're working with in that clinical field placement. The assessment is student-centered. I'm going to say more about that in a minute, and focused on student learning. The rubrics are analytic. I have another whole item, that is my item number 6 that I'm going to get to, about why it's useful to have analytic rubrics. And the assessment is integrative, meaning that it pulls together the learning experiences of candidates across their whole curriculum. It isn't just something at the end that they check off, but they have to think thoughtfully about their prior clinical experiences, their methods coursework, their foundations coursework, and their lived experiences to be successful on EdTPA. So what is it? It is a summative assessment of teaching practice. It does have a common architecture, as I've described. It is subject-specific, subject-specific, subject-specific. Each subject-specific candidate constructs a portfolio that documents and describes and explains and analyzes a learning segment, a short stream of instruction within usually a larger unit that they plan in their clinical experience. It is about 3 to 5 days of instruction. There are some of those requirements vary by subject area, but basically 3 to 5 hours with kids, teaching them a learning segment that has a core central focus for student learning and a series of lessons that build toward those understandings. The plans the candidates put together in the learning segment have to be based on their context in which they teach and their knowledge of their students. It's not plan a set of 3 lessons and do it without knowing anything about your kids. What they know about their students is crucial. They have to think deeply about their students' academic, social, emotional, and language development. They have to think deeply about their students' prior academic learning, their students' lived experiences, their family, community, and cultural assets. In other words, what do their students bring to school that they need to build from in order to have successful teaching and learning? They assemble a portfolio that is a collection of authentic artifacts, and I'll say more about that, and commentaries where they analyze and explain and justify their steps for teaching. So it's not just plan the lessons and put in a video, it's really what is my thinking behind this teaching. So here's a little graphic that shows how the portfolio is organized around 3 tasks: planning, instruction, and assessment, and how these are viewed as a cycle in support of student learning. And if you look at the fine print in each bubble, each of those terms or phrases represents a rubric construct, an analytic rubric that is being used to measure the candidate's performance or to evaluate the candidate's performance. On the outer edges, we see academic language all 3 times, because an emphasis on academic language is what ties the learning segment together across planning, instruction, and assessment. And then the other parts in the inner circle are all about how a candidate justifies or analyzes their teaching or uses data from the learning segment to plan next steps for instruction. So this is the conceptual design, if you will. So to get at this idea of subject specific, let me say a little bit about how each subject area is defined. And we consulted with SPA representatives and subject matter organization representatives and practicing teachers in the fields, as well as an examination of the various standards in those fields to come up with what we like to call the subject-specific nugget for student learning for which the teaching is designed. And I just listed here some of the more routine subject areas, but we have these nuggets for every field you can imagine. In a moment, I'm going to show you all the handbook titles so you can see. So I'm just going to highlight history social studies here, and this nugget is similar for both secondary and middle childhood versions of the handbook. But what a candidate does is to teach in such a way that students in their classroom will develop understandings of facts and concepts and be able to interpret or analyze those facts and concepts to support arguments about historical events, a topic or theme, or a social studies phenomena. The focus is on developing argument, not just facts and concepts, but why did something happen the way it happened? What's our evidence? How do we use primary sources? How do we use text to understand that topic or that series of events? And all the subject areas have something similarly rich. So what do candidates do? They compile a portfolio. They put together their records of practice. And so for planning, they have their instructional materials, their lesson plans. They have their description of their instructional and social context. And they do a planning commentary justifying those plans based on what they know about their kids, as well as what they know about their students as learners and any special needs, challenges, or strengths that they bring. In the instruction task, they submit 1 or 2 video clips, and for each subject area, they have to choose clips that represent certain kinds of teaching in that field. And they write a commentary analyzing what worked well and what didn't. And if they could teach those lessons again, what would they do differently to better support student learning, and what's their justification for those changes? In the assessment task, they analyze a whole class set of student materials on an assessment that they have designed or adapted for the learning segment. After analyzing and summarizing the whole class, they identify 3 focus students for whom they have provided feedback, and they describe the learning of those 3 kids and how and why that feedback is supporting them in their next steps for learning. And they use the whole analysis to inform their next steps for teaching. Along the way, they are constantly evaluating, analyzing, justifying, defending their teaching decisions, and looking at the extent to which they're building their students' academic language. And when we talk about academic language, we do so in terms of the language of the discipline. What are the words and terms and ways of using language, the language functions that are necessary in order to understand content deeply in that field of study? So for example, I mentioned a minute ago about history social studies and the emphasis on argument. So a very important language function in historical thought or in the discipline of history, historians are always constructing argument. So knowing how to frame an argument, knowing how to write about argument, knowing how to speak argument, those are language functions that students need to learn and develop so that they can read and write and think as a history social studies student. Okay, so that's the framing. How am I for time? Okay. So how many handbooks do we have? I mentioned 27. These were the fields that we field tested last year, and we've refined them, revised them, moving them forward. So we have a variety available for elementary and early childhood, middle childhood, and all the secondary fields that you would imagine. Some of the handbooks are suitable for K-12 or P-12. Some states have visual arts credentials, for example, that are K-12. So we have designed the handbooks to meet the needs of major licensure areas in major states. And as of this year, we now have met all of the licensure areas for the state of New York and most others around the country. So hopefully you will have seen all of the subject area credentials you offer here in Pennsylvania. Okay. How about a question while I have a sip of water? Stumped? What are you wondering about? Yes. The National Board Certified Teacher. Tell us your name. Hi, Amy. Very similar in structure, but not nearly the same bar, right? Because the National Board is for accomplished teachers, and we've designed this assessment as an assessment of novices and in terms of readiness to teach. But you've raised a good point. What happens if a candidate doesn't pass? What happens if a candidate doesn't pass? What happens if a candidate doesn't pass clinical teaching, their clinical supervision or their clinical placement on your campuses? There's usually 3 paths. They get another try, or wait a sec, they get additional support, they get another try, or they're counseled out. Sometimes they get additional support, they get another try, they get another try, they get another try, they get another try, they're counseled out. So with EdTPA, it will be no different. If at first you don't succeed, try again. Now, states will need to make some decisions about how many tries are reasonable and under what time frame those tries are reasonable. But we've built a system for scoring and reporting so that there will be opportunities for students who are unsuccessful to have additional support, try again, resubmit, and be rescored. Now, the decision rules on that aren't finished until we do our standard setting. Because when we do our standard setting and we have the national standard set, and that standard is determined as both an aggregate score, a total score, as well as scores related to a number of scoring components that I'm going to talk about in a minute, then you've got to think about what gets resubmitted, the whole thing or some portion. I want to come back to that at the end. But now I see there's more hands. See, this is what happens if I pause. Then there's lots of questions. But I'm going to ask you to hold, because I just realized I'm only getting to number 5, and I have 10. and I want to make sure that I have plenty of time for the last one. So I'm going to do the next few pretty swiftly, and then we're going to go to the one that I'm caring most about, number 10. So EdTPA is intended to be, where's our tech people? What button did I push? I don't want to send.
Just crashed on you?
Yeah, it crashed. So I'm going to have to...
You can go and find the current
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do.
slide.
Sorry, everybody. You just love it when you do something weird and... Why is my little bar not showing up? Okay. So is it number 5? Okay. We should be on track now. There we go. Sorry. Multiple measures. So EdTPA is intended to be in a multiple measure system, and because there are 15 rubrics, it offers multiple measures itself. But it's important to note that the rubrics, which I'm going to share a little bit more about in a moment, can be used formatively, and the information you get back from those rubrics can be very useful as evidence for program renewal, review, accreditation, and the rubrics, of course, are used summatively. So EdTPA is not intended to replace some of the things that are already really important that are embedded in your programs. It's intended as a capstone, as a summative assessment that helps candidates integrate what they've learned about these various pieces of teaching and put them together in an experience in a clinical setting. But it does not replace embedded signature assignments or assessments you already have associated with your coursework that you might be using as transition point assessments for NCATE, or that you use internally to determine when a candidate is ready to move from coursework into clinical experiences and then to their ultimate clinical experience. And it's certainly, and this is a myth that's out there, so I'm going to be very emphatic about this one. It does not replace clinical supervision. By no stretch of the imagination does it replace clinical supervision. Clinical supervisors, the relationship between that faculty member, that student teacher, and the cooperating teacher is essential to developing a teacher as ready to teach. And you have to have those ongoing observations in order to know if they're good to go. EdTPA is a capstone that allows them to integrate some of those experiences and show what they know in the end game. Yeah, I think I've been emphatic enough. Okay, so if you were considering using EdTPA, you might have some questions about how it could align with what you are already doing. So you want to start by asking, to what extent does this assessment reflect our program values? Is it what we believe in or not? If you think it might be useful, where do you predict your students might struggle a little bit? Or where would they do well? What core values and program emphases are not captured by EdTPA? Remember, multiple measure system. You've got to have some other tools in place. This is not going to be a measure of all of their breadth of content knowledge. Even though it's subject specific, it doesn't intend to measure full breadth of content knowledge. Pedagogical content knowledge, major strategies, high leverage teaching behaviors in a field, yes, but not all the content. It will not be a very good measure of all the dispositions that you care about. Many dispositions are revealed in EdTPA, but the best way to understand a candidate's dispositions is by observing them in many settings and interacting with them over time. So, you can also ask, what kinds of assessments do you currently use, or might you need to get at some of these things that are missed by EdTPA? So, ultimately, what you're not going to do is throw out your assessment system like throwing babies out with the bathwater. You will want to think about how EdTPA supports, augments, fleshes out your assessment system for some very important purposes. On to number 6, analytic rubrics. Some assessments have rubrics that are let me say, very broad sweeping statements about a standard, and then merely change adjectives from level to level so that you can bucket or bin performance based on the weight of the evidence rather than the particulars of the evidence. Our EdTPA rubrics are analytic. We have 15 constructs associated with planning, instruction, assessment, analysis of teaching effectiveness, and academic language. The 15 rubrics across those areas get at what we might call high leverage teaching behaviors. And I already flashed this graphic up here before, but as I said, the items in the bubbles for planning, instruction, assessment are actual rubric constructs that we examine in looking at the candidate's performance in each of those tasks. And academic language is assessed by 2 rubrics, and analysis of teaching is analyzed or is examined with evidence as a candidate justifies their planning for their intended teaching, how they analyze their enacted teaching in the instruction task, and how they use data to inform instruction as part of the assessment task. Those are all 3 ways of looking at teaching effectiveness and a candidate's ability to reflect on their success, what's working well, what they would change. Our rubrics have 5 levels, and all of the rubrics use a similar sort of progression. And notice there are no numbers here really in the middle. And I also want you to know that these left-hand titles, teacher focus, whole class, fragmented, indiscriminate, aren't necessarily at level 1 in the rubric, but they're definitely shades of less sophisticated practice. But as you move along the continuum to this side, you will see the kinds of practices that are much more student-focused and student learning-focused, perhaps even understanding the needs of individuals or flexible groups. And lastly, that a candidate's practice presents evidence that shows that their teaching is intentional, that it is well integrated, and it is well executed. It's thoughtful, it's deliberate, and it's deeply seated in a knowledge base. And then in the middle, we have some of each. But all the rubrics are designed to get at a candidate's deepening rationale and expanding repertoire of skills and strategies. So here's one quick sample of a rubric, and this is from elementary mathematics, and it is the 5th planning rubric, and it focuses on how a candidate considers the learning outcomes they intend in the learning segment and how they will monitor student learning toward them over the 3 to 5 days of instruction. And I wonder if there's a little, is there a little, oh, there is. Look, I have a little red dot there. Notice that attention to the law related to IEP and 504 plans is embedded in the rubrics. The focus here is on how they plan to collect evidence of student learning, multiple occasions, multiple types of evidence at multiple points along the learning segment. And at the very top end of the rubric there is the attention to individuals and groups with specific needs. Now note, the IEP needs must be met at level 2, but the modifications and considerations and adaptations for assessments for all kids with a variety of learning is at the very top of the rubric. That's hard to do. And so if you looked across all of our rubrics, you would see at level 5